Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard. Welcome in to another new episode of The Lager Line, served to you as always courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbox Brewing. I'm your host, Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire and a contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. Joined today by my good friend and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves, our co-host. You can follow him on Twitter at Paulo Alves NBA. Follow me on there at Ben Dubose. And I'm thrilled to announce off the top, we've got a great guest joining us today. Her name is Caitlin Cooper. If you aren't following her on Twitter already at C2_Cooper, you absolutely should be, because in my opinion, she's one of the best X's and O's people in basketball media, hands down. She knows the day in, day out of this NBA landscape, as well as anybody in basketball media, in terms of the way teams and coaching staffs are looking at information. And so I think she's a natural to have on in this episode where, for obvious reasons, we're going to be looking at the Houston Rockets coaching search, which is now a week old. We're recording this on Sunday, April 16th, exactly 1 week from when it became clear the Rockets were moving on from Stephen Silas as their head coach after 3 seasons. And while I think Caitlin knows the NBA as a whole, she specializes in the Indiana Pacers. That's where she's been a writer for a number of years across numerous outlets. Right now, she operates her own Patreon called Basketball She Wrote. You can find her content there off of her Twitter page at C2_Cooper. The Pacers are the team she specializes in, just as Paolo and myself specialize in the Rockets. And the reason we want to talk to a Pacers person today, one of the clear frontrunners for the Rockets head coaching vacancy, is former Pacers coach Frank Vogel. He was an assistant in Indiana from 2007 through 2010, and then the head coach from 2010 until 2016. Now, since then, Vogel has coached the Orlando Magic for 2 seasons and the LA Lakers for 3, including the 2020 NBA championship with the Lakers. But even as a head coach, he was in Indiana longer than Orlando and LA combined. And if you add in the assistant years, it's basically twice as long, 5 years to 10. So I think it's the Pacer side of the backstory for Frank Vogel that's probably most representative of who he is as a coach. Now, I don't want to say that he hasn't evolved in the 7 years since he left Indiana. Again, 2016 was his last year there. It's now 2023. I'm sure there's things that he's learned and adapted and put into his coaching style at his latter stops. But I think the Pacers years were really the formation of his, I suppose, philosophies. And so I think there's a ton to be learned from that. And we can also compare and contrast and talk about what we saw, and Caitlin in particular, what she saw from Vogel with the Lakers when they won that title in 2020. Was there anything different other than LeBron James being on his side this time with the Lakers, as opposed to when Vogel built those Pacers teams into contenders in the early 2010s? They always had LeBron James and the Miami Heat as their roadblock in the playoffs. Were there any other changes? We'll talk to her about that as well. But I think people who understand and follow the Indiana Pacers know Frank Vogel best. And so when I look at the Indiana Pacers media landscape, I can think of no one I'd rather talk to than Caitlin Cooper. So that's what we're going to be doing today in our Frank Vogel themed episode. The reason I'm leading off with a few introductory comments, when we get Caitlin connected, I want it to be about her. I don't want to make her listen to me ramble. So I want to tell you guys the intel I have off the top to sort of set the table for our discussion with Caitlin Cooper. And then when we are lucky enough to have her on, be able to focus the discussion around her insights and what she saw over the many years of Frank Vogel in Indiana and anything she's picked up on in the years since. The reason that we're going to be talking about Frank Vogel, I'll be blunt with you guys off the top. From everything that I know, both from reading reports locally, Jonathan Fagan of the Houston Chronicle, nationally, Adrian Wojnarowski of ESPN, as well as the conversations I've had with people inside the building at Toyota Center, I do believe that Frank Vogel is a very clear candidate and perhaps a front runner at this stage to be the successor to Steven Silas as head coach of the Rockets. He interviewed last week. According to Adrian Wojnarowski, it went very well. I've heard the same. And Woj reports that he will be brought back at some point for a second interview as this coaching search progresses. Now, the Rockets are casting a wide net. We've heard, for example, the last few days. Friday, they interviewed Kevin Young, an assistant with the Suns. Saturday, they interviewed Adrian Griffin, an assistant with the Toronto Raptors. They've agreed to interview Sam Cassell, an assistant with the Philadelphia 76ers. None have previous NBA head coaching experience. While I do think the Rockets will cast a wide net, it's silly not to in a coaching search. If nothing else, you're making connections for the future. You're talking to sharp basketball guys. Maybe there's things you can pick up on. There's also a possibility that even if they're not ultimately your head coaching selection this time, there's other roles they could be a fit for. John Lucas was a finalist in 2020, and he ended up becoming the lead assistant and has done a pretty good job the last 3 years from everything that I can tell, and people that I talk to inside the building love him. In 2016, Steven Silas was a finalist in the search that went to Mike D'Antoni, and 4 years later, Silas ended up getting the job. So there's lots of reasons to cast a wide net when you have a search. If nothing else, just get to know people and learn more things. But I do think that unless someone blows them away or the landscape changes dramatically, the Rockets want a more proven option. I've heard that a number of places. We've talked on this show, the Logger Line, in the past about many of the reasons why. But there's just a lot of benefits given some of the hits that this organization has taken in recent months to really restoring the credibility with a coach that's been there, done that. And I think it's even more important going into a summer where you have, give or take, about $60 million in cap space, most of any team in the NBA. And of course, it can really help your appeal on the market if you have a coach leading your organization that has had proven success elsewhere. So I think the Rockets, while they'll talk to a lot of people, including assistants, they want someone with proven experience. And from everything I've seen and have been told, I think there's a clear top four right now of Frank Vogel, former coach of the Pacers, Magic, and Lakers, Ime Udoka, former coach of the Boston Celtics, Nick Nurse, current coach of the Toronto Raptors, and Kenny Atkinson, current assistant with the Golden State Warriors, but former head coach of the Brooklyn Nets from 2016 through 2020. Of those four, I think as of now, the most likely are Vogel and Udoka. I'm not going to say one is more likely than the other, but I think, and availability being one of the biggest reasons, they're slightly higher than Atkinson and Nurse. There's some different concerns with each of those guys. With Kenny Atkinson, his resume, while good, he did help lift the Nets from a very low point in their rebuild post Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett, and get them back to a relevant level. It's not quite the same as guys like Vogel, Nick Nurse, and Ime Udoka that have been to the NBA Finals, and in the case of Nurse and Vogel, won the NBA Finals within the last 4 years. Kenny Atkinson helped get the Nets off the ground, but his experience at the highest level has come as an assistant to Steve Kerr with the Warriors. While I don't think that's something that would automatically eliminate him from discussions with the Rockets, it's at least a relevant variable that I think they're going to consider. Another factor with Atkinson is that his track record is a bit more tilted towards the offensive side, whereas the other three, Nurse, Vogel, and Udoka, come with more defensive pedigree. For a lot of reasons, and Jonathan Fagan of the Chronicle has talked about this, the rule of opposites tends to apply in many of these coaching searches, in that when teams want a different voice, as Rafael Stone said at the press conference last week, many times it's that they want the culture to shift a little bit from what it was. And Steven Silas was an offense first hire. That's what he did when he was the top assistant to Rick Carlisle in Dallas. So Atkinson having something of a similar profile to Steven, I don't know if that's the best fit in a search where the Rockets are looking to clearly change the voice a bit and perhaps bring out more on the defensive side of the ball with guys like Jalen Green and Alperen Şengün and this young core that you have in place. I think the Rockets will hear Atkinson out. He's a brilliant guy, but I just think that it's a bit of a headwind. The other factor, how much does he want it? We know he almost took the Charlotte job a year ago, but backed out, in large part because he's got a great situation in Golden State. It's a perennial contender. They won the NBA title last year. the most dominant franchise of this generation. It's a great city to live in. He's very comfortable as the lead assistant. He gets paid a healthy salary, but he doesn't have nearly the pressures of a head coach. It's an easier lifestyle. Does he want the grind of being the guy and responsible for everything and talking to the media every day and everything in the company's being a head coach? That remains to be seen. The Warriors have granted him permission to interview, and I know the Rockets want to talk to him. I've heard that he has a good relationship with Rafael Stone, going back to the days that Atkinson worked on the Jeff Van Gundy staff when he was the Rockets coach in the mid 2000s, which is when Rafael Stone came on board. They'll talk to him. I just think he has questions to answer, and that puts him slightly below the tier of Udoka and Vogel, in my opinion. Vogel interviewed last week and Udoka interviewing Monday or Tuesday. We'll see how he does. With Nick Nurse, look, at the moment, he's a tier lower because he's under contract with the Raptors. And some of this is going to come down to how bad does he want it. Right now, he can't just interview with the Rockets because he's a coach with another team. He has a guaranteed salary for next year. Now, maybe he's willing to give that up, but only he can speak to how much and the lengths he's willing to go to make that happen. Because what happens if he gives up his job with the Raptors and doesn't get the Houston vacancy? There's only one other opening in the entire NBA right now, and that's Detroit. And they seem to be in a slightly lower income bracket. To this point, it's pretty clear Tillman Fertitta is willing to invest, as we've pointed out in our prior episodes. The list of guys the Rockets are talking to, current and former NBA head coaches, you have to pay a pretty penny to get in the door with those guys. Detroit seems to be in a slightly lower bracket, so I'm not sure if Nurse would even be a fit there anyway. And other than that, every position is taken right now. Maybe that changes after the playoffs, but right now there's only 2 openings. Would Nurse give up his job and a guaranteed salary with the Raptors just to interview with the Rockets? If not, he may just try to patch things up because while not perfect, it's not like the Raptors are a terrible situation. They have prestige. They won a championship fairly recently. They've got talented players. They made the play-in tournament this season. It's not like it's a wasteland. You could easily see a scenario where he says, you know what, let's give it one more year. Let's see what happens. And if it doesn't work out, then I'll explore the market when my contract is actually up, as opposed to negotiating a settlement, a divorce, basically, without having the next job lined up. And I don't think that Nurse is so good in terms of his resume that if you're the Rockets, that you can offer him the job without interviewing. You can't just say, in my opinion, Nick, if you get your divorce from Toronto, you're our guy. No, these other guys the Rockets are talking to, guys like Atkinson and Vogel and Udoka, they're very, very qualified. And through this process, again, Vogel reportedly had a very good interview. The Rockets are learning more about the fit, the chemistry, the alignment, which is something we talked about last week on this show, being so important for this team moving forward as they try and get out of the depths of the last 3 years, the total rebuild, and gradually move back into contention mode. I don't think Nick Nurse, while a good coach, he's not prime Greg Popovich. You don't just say he is so good that without an interview, I'm willing to guarantee him the job if he leaves Toronto. And short of that, I don't know if he's willing to do that because he is going to have to risk something to get that interview with the Rockets. Only he can answer whether he is willing enough to make that move. Some of it may also be factors on the Raptors end. There's been some whispers that they might want Ime Udoka. Maybe Udoka interviewing with the Rockets this week makes them push for a resolution with Nurse sooner so they can potentially get in the coaching market themselves. Maybe the Raptors are thinking they can extract compensation in terms of a trade for Nurse's rights since he's under contract, although I personally cannot see the Rockets doing that because, again, the delta in resumes between Nurse and the guys they're interviewing now is just not significant enough, not nearly significant enough, in my opinion, to be worth giving compensation in terms of future draft assets, whatever it may be, for Nurse's services. I think the bottom line is Nick's got to decide how much he wants it. And if he wants it a lot, then sure, he can force his way into the conversation. But right now, as we're recording this on Sunday, April 16th, it just doesn't seem that he's quite to the level of Udoka or Vogel in this search simply because he just doesn't have the same availability. There's an easy way for the Rockets to pick the brains of these other guys, and they're very qualified. And ultimately, the way I see it, the ball is in Nick's court. Maybe he wants to be involved in the search, and if so, I think there's a path for him to get to that top tier. But right now, in my opinion, the top tier is clearly Udoka and Vogel. And I think it's close. I think it could go either way. I think the Rockets are keeping an open mind. The case for Udoka, and I think on social media and the blogs, he'll be a more popular choice simply because he has more of the buzz factor, the it factor. He's really just had 1 year as a head coach, and it was wildly successful, taking the Celtics to the 2022 NBA Finals. Everyone saw the connections he made with those players, including Jaylen Brown, who there's been whispers the last few weeks. Maybe the Rockets go after Jaylen Brown. If you have his former coach, maybe that helps. You don't make a decision based on that, but it sure as hell doesn't hurt. But I think it ties into the larger theme of he clearly made connections in that Boston locker room. They played together. They bought in. He's a former player, which helps Udoka in making those types of connections. He worked for a number of years under Greg Popovich, which helps him a lot, working with the greatest coach in NBA history. He worked with a lot of egos in Boston, very talented players. So you can make a case for him. And I think his buzz factor is a lot higher than Frank Vogel because Vogel's had more failures. The last we saw of Frank Vogel was the Lakers letting him go after the 2022 season, whereas the Celtics got to the NBA Finals. And last we saw of Udoka, it was really not for basketball reasons. He got let go before the season due to the alleged affair with a staff member in Boston. The good news, at least in terms of his candidacy, I've been told that the background, the references, whatever you want to call it, the Rockets have looked into that, and I don't think that will be the reason that he wouldn't get this job. I think he'll be evaluated on his own merits. So if you're an Ime Udoka fan, I think he's going to get a real look, and he has some definite pros in his column. However, the one negative, he's got the buzz factor, he's younger, and I think the fact he hasn't had any clear failures, it sort of puts a halo over him. But the downside is that he's only been a head coach for 1 year, and he did walk into a very loaded situation in Boston. What's it going to be like in a roster with the Rockets that's very, very different and coming from a very different place? Not saying it can't work out, but it is a question. As opposed to Frank Vogel, he's had success in a number of situations. When he took over in Indiana in 2010, they had a number of rebuilding years, not quite to the extent of the Rockets in terms of truly bottoming out, but lots of teams with wins in the 30s, the post Reggie Miller, Ron Artest era. He built them into a contender with Paul George, and maybe there's some parallels between Paul George and Jalen Green, the way they can be used. We'll talk to Caitlin about that. Then we saw the Pacers fall off after the catastrophic leg injury to Paul George with with USA Basketball. And then he took over a couple of years after that, a rebuilding Orlando Magic team with a terrible roster that did not work out. Then he became the head coach of the Lakers, and they won the NBA championship in 2020. Now, they did have a fall off after that, but I would argue that just as with Orlando, the roster construction was a major issue. It was a big one in LA as well, the biggest one being the trade for Russell Westbrook, which I don't think Vogel had anything to do with. And even this year, when the Lakers made the playoffs, they didn't really take off until after they traded Russell Westbrook away and got him off of that roster. So I think you could argue that some of the so-called failures with the Lakers and Magic, there were some circumstances to that. And the same can be said with the Pacers, where they were a legitimate contender in a smaller market. That's not easy to do. And Vogel had the Pacers right on the precipice. They just couldn't quite get over the hump of LeBron James and the Miami Heat. And then things went south once everything happened with Paul George and his leg. And in 2016, the Pacers decided to look a different direction. The bottom line, Vogel has just had a greater diversity of situations than Udoka has. That's, I suppose, the biggest plus in his column. And even though he's been a head coach for 10 years, he's still only 49 years old. So we talk about all his experience, but he basically just got started young. Let's not make him out to be Mike D'Antoni and that he theoretically can only be around for a few years. No, he's still young enough. He could do this for a while if things work out. So Udoka's, I think, the buzz of your name, and he'll get a legitimate look this week when he interviews, and his connections with players that he formed with the Celtics. And again, he's a former player himself. That cannot be overlooked. But Vogel has some clear positives as well in terms of the depths of situations that he's dealt with. A lot of different, from total rebuilds to a situation in the Lakers with incredibly high expectations and egos to manage between LeBron James and Anthony Davis, and then the Pacers, which was sort of a hodgepodge of everything over the 6 years as a head coach there, and Ted, if you include his assistant time. So he can speak a lot more confidently to, no matter the situation, I know what I'm doing, and be a steadying hand. Whereas with Udoka, there's a lot of positives, but there's a bit more risk than you might think just based on the name, if you will. Anyway, that's where I think we're at right now. And I don't want to go on any longer because this episode is about Caitlin. I just wanted to lead off with some initial comments about where things are, the state of play on Sunday, April 16th with the Rockets coaching search. And now the rest of this episode will be Caitlin Cooper talking about Frank Vogel. Hopefully we'll do this in a few days on Ime Udoka with someone that has a bit more expertise on the Boston side of the fence, or perhaps San Antonio, given all his time as an assistant there. I'm working on that. But for now, Frank Vogel was the first to interview amongst this top tier, and according to all reports, it went very well. So let's talk about him a bit more. Caitlin, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. How are you?
Doing well. Like I told you before I hopped on, I'm excited to try to rack my brain from the last time I watched Frank Vogel coach for the Indiana Pacers and to try to give you the best information that I can today.
What's interesting is that he's literally or was there for 10 years. The 6 years feels long enough in the lead role, which is longer than Orlando and LA combined. But then you combine it with the 4 as an assistant. That's a really long time in NBA years, because it feels like, the last 2 Rockets coaches, Mike D'Antoni, Stephen Silas, lasted 4 years and 3 years respectively. To last 10 years in one place, granted the first 4 were as an assistant, that's a really long time. So that's why, even though we're now 7 years removed from that, I'm thinking you sort of have a good overview of, I guess, the fundamentals, the principles of Frank Vogel on both sides of the ball, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it's even more interesting you pointing out how long he had been there, given how his tenure ended with, which I'm sure we'll get to, with Larry Bird saying that, coaches' voices grow stale after 3 years. And that
Yeah.
was the reason why they didn't renew his contract. So
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
his tenure definitely lasted longer than 3 years.
A lot longer. And of course, definitely some positives. It's difficult, in today's NBA for a smaller market team like the Pacers to succeed. And yet, with Frank, they did get to a contending level with the Paul George team in the early 2010s. Never got over the LeBron James hump. But all in all, a pretty successful tenure. But yes, 6 years in the lead role in particular, that's a long time in the modern NBA. And we've seen that firsthand in Houston. Anyway, Caitlin, I wanted to start you with this. When I heard last week that Vogel was an increasingly serious candidate for the Rockets, I reached out to a friend of mine in the national NBA media to ask them what they thought about Vogel and the Rockets as a fit. And this was by DM, so I'm not going to say who it was. I'm just going to say it's a national voice that I think we both know and respect. And they responded to me with this: great for development and professionalism, no bullshit, real person. Offensive concepts need updating, but with a good staff could be ideal. Caitlin, as like a 30,000-foot overview, does that mesh with what you saw on the ground in Indiana, and I suppose what you've seen from afar the last 5 years that he was in Orlando and LA?
Yeah, but I think that's a pretty accurate paraphrasing of what I would describe from my knowledge of Frank Vogel to be. I mean, when you look at this, the fit for the Houston job, I guess I would ask both of you. I mean, I know from the reporting and from the games that I watched of Houston this year, but you two are obviously in the trenches watching that team every game. In your estimation, why was Stephen Silas no longer a fit there? I mean, I know the Rockets ranked in the bottom 5 in both offense and defense. There wasn't a lot of progress on the offensive end with D, but is there also a cultural element to that in terms of what the locker room was like with Stephen Silas as well?
That depends on who you talk to. I think the bigger factor for the Rockets is that they will tell you that some of the cultural critiques that were out there were more perception than reality. Yet as they go into, I guess, the next phase of the rebuild, obviously they're not going to be trying to tank starting next year because the bill for their draft picks to OKC from the Russ trade comes due. So for a lot of reasons, they're going to try to win next year. And it definitely behooves them to try and bolster their appeal on the market, given the fact that they have the most cap space of any NBA team this summer. And so I think part of it is that it's sort of like, even if some of the cultural issues are overdone, just the perception of them has them sort of leaning towards someone with more credibility. Because the thing with Steven is, even if you give him the benefit of the doubt on some of the X's and O's and look at how insanely young these last couple of rosters have been, he's never done it in the lead chair before. Whereas the 4 guys that appear to be their lead candidates this time, Frank, Ime Udoka, Nick Nurse and Kenny Atkinson have all been there, done that as far as the lead job. So I think that's sort of the perspective of that they're looking at it. It's partially, they would like the team to play harder. They would like to instill more of like a disciplined, defensive oriented culture. Silas came from more of an offensive background. But I think also they just want, both for real reasons and perception reasons, there to be a bit more, I guess, proven credibility in that lead seat. Does that make sense?
It totally does. And I mean, I think from Frank's standpoint, the one thing that I would really want to ream home is that when he first got elevated just as the interim tag in 2011, before he got the full-time job as head coach, he was exactly the person they needed at the time when they needed him, because they were coming out of Jim O'Brien that season.
Mm-hmm.
And there was basically an edict from Larry Bird that Frank and the coaching staff that there was going to be no more negativity, because that was a franchise very much mired in negativity, where there had been, public criticism of Roy Hibbert. Paul George didn't necessarily have the freedom to go out there and make mistakes. The only way he was getting on the floor, which, I mean, somewhat he credits to Jim O'Brien now, that in order for him to get on the floor, he had to be a defense first player. That's how he was going to get to play. But that's not exactly what you want for a guy who you drafted, in the top 10 of the draft that season. So when Frank took over, he brought this very positive energy that Paul George still credits to this day for his own development, that he needed that they needed that uplifting energy in the locker room every day after going through that. And, he obviously, with Roy Hibbert very early on, turned him into, Roy became what we think of verticality. He became a defensive identity. A lot of that was because of Frank Vogel. And in that 2011 season, he told Paul George, like, you're going to be in the starting lineup against the Chicago Bulls in the playoffs. And not only are you going to be in the starting lineup, you're going to be guarding Derrick Rose by game 2 and be defending him at the point of attack, and gave him a lot of responsibility in that regard as well. So just in the sense that Frank was very much, like I said, like a ray of sunshine when that franchise didn't have it. I don't know if you would describe Houston in the same way and needing that type of a personality. But, offensively, I think it might be a little bit of the reverse scenario, especially with like Jalen Green, because, Paul George too, since he's been with the Clippers, has looked back at that time with Frank Vogel and kind of discussed the fact that really headed into his third season, there was no expectations on the Pacers that year because Danny Granger had the knee procedure. He was out indefinitely. Nobody was really expecting a lot from the Pacers that year. So Frank was willing to throw Paul into the fire and let him play through mistakes and really allow him to grow into being the star level player that he became that season when they ended up going to the Eastern Conference Finals against the Miami Heat, and that Frank had challenged him that year when they had lost to the Heat in the 2012 playoffs before that as well. So what Paul needed was a lot more freedom to be able to play through mistakes that he didn't have under his prior coach. And to me, when I watch Jalen Green from the outside, it's almost like Jalen Green needs somebody who's going to give him more structure and give him more play calls so that he can learn to make more reads. So it's almost like the reverse scenario with the two of them a bit.
Yeah, that's definitely fascinating to hear how the dynamics changed, or what the thing of dynamics would need to be for the Rockets, for Frank Vogel to work for the Rockets. That being said, I think just from the vibe that I get from the fan base, Vogel's not exactly the sexiest coach or the sexiest name for a head coach. People want Nick Nurse, people want Ime Udoka, people want Kenny Atkinson. And I actually wanted to kind of defend a little bit this Frank Vogel, because people usually, their last impression of a head coach is what they think of him. With Nick Nurse, he had a job right now. Ime Udoka, the last time he had a job, he went to the NBA Finals. And Kenny Atkinson kind of withdrew himself from that situation in Brooklyn because of obviously what happened with KD and Kyrie, but he didn't crash and burn before leaving, I would say. Mm-hmm. So I actually wanted to provide some context just a little bit about the biggest kind of problem people have with Frank Vogel was how he did with the Magic. And I would challenge anyone who has that take to go back and look at the Magic situation back then. We're talking about a GM that had just traded Victor Oladipo and Sabonis for Serge Ibaka. This was a team composed of a lot of guys in their mid-20s. If you wanted to look for upside, you probably had Aaron Gordon, and that was probably it. And they were trying to make him, their centerpiece. And it's just, well, we know what Aaron Gordon is today. And it was just a terrible fit. It was a terrible 2 years. There wasn't a good situation. The Magic weren't good before he got there. They weren't good after they fired him. So I think the Magic stint is largely, when you put context to it, it really doesn't, it doesn't make sense to judge the entire career off of it. And then the Lakers stint it's like, he got there, he outcoached the hell out of Mike D'Antoni when they played the Rockets. He won a title, although in the bubble. And then they traded for Russell Westbrook. I mean, they were the 1 seed when they won the title, so you can't credit it all to the bubble. And then they traded for Russell Westbrook, which left a lot of people scratching their heads. And that didn't make sense on paper. And then it turns out that it didn't make sense on the floor. And even the year after he was fired, they only became good when they actually traded Russell Westbrook. So can you really blame Vogel for being the fall guy for just a terrible Russell Westbrook trade? I don't think you can. But even with all of that context, we know Rockets fans, and I think the only way we'll really get to, give a good view of what the strengths and weaknesses are for Frank Vogel is, I would say we should talk about his defense. To me, one of the big draws of Frank Vogel was his defensive versatility, but we only got to see that, as Rockets fans for one series. What would you say are his philosophies defensively in terms of holding guys accountable, in terms of the schemes he likes to run?
Yeah, so with Indiana, I mean, because you have Roy Hibbert and what they're doing and having to schematically do with the verticality, and because you're not going to play him at the level, you don't really want him out on the perimeter. It was predominantly all deep drop with Roy, funneling everything to the middle. And then if it was David West or Luis Scola, it was stunt or hedge at the 4 possession to get everything middle. So I would say, I wouldn't call it stubbornness, because that was what the personnel was dictating for him to do. But there were times in playoff series where it was like, okay, probably need to make a little bit of an adjustment there, So when they played the Atlanta Hawks in the first round of the 2013-14 playoffs, kind of infamously, Mike Scott had like a 17 or 19 point game where he hit like 3 threes in a row on 3 straight possessions, and it was all with Luis Scola and hedge, and they didn't alter the scheme at all. Like, it was more so the fact that Mike Scott just finally stopped hitting shots.
Right.
So there wasn't necessarily an adjustments there, but like I said, like, a lot of that's your personnel dictating the scheme. I think if we want to jump ahead a little bit, and obviously you guys saw him firsthand in that bubble series against the Rockets, but like looking into last year with the Lakers, I think that some Lakers fans would probably say there was some stubbornness on the defensive end of the floor from a schematic standpoint. I mean, I can point to one game in particular where the Pacers played the Lakers in LA. It got to be the 4th quarter, and Karis LeVert scored 20 points. And after the game, there was kind of an infamous quote that came out from the coaching staff. I believe it was to Dave McMenamin, where it got put in the article that it had been emphasized repeatedly to Westbrook to take Karis LeVert's right hand away, so essentially be weakening him on middle pick and rolls. He didn't do that, and he reached middle, gambled, and LeVert got right into the paint and route to the hoop for a layup. And this happened with like 7 minutes and 13 seconds remaining. Well, when I broke that down, like, I ended up having a thread of that after the game, because Frank left Westbrook in for like 2 more minutes after that pretty big faux pas occurred. And earlier in the game, they were not weakening Karis LeVert to his left. So if that was the game plan the whole game and they had been emphasizing it, they weren't doing it before the 4th quarter. And then my bigger quibble would be, like, why were you defending Sabonis with Carmelo Anthony in drop against Karis LeVert in the first place? And they kept Carmelo Anthony in drop for the entirety of that 4th quarter, instead of being like, oh, hey, let's switch LeBron onto Sabonis and go to switching so that we can switch LeBron onto LeVert, or at least switch somebody else besides Westbrook so you can weaken him. And then the bigger thing is, like, I had a direct quote in that thread, and if you watched Karis enough that season, Karis prefers to go to his left. He wants to reject screens that are on his right side and go to the left. So the scout wasn't even completely correct on that. So in that sense, like, Frank Vogel had more flexibility with the players that were on the floor to go to a switching scheme in that 4th quarter, and he didn't make that adjustment. With the Pacers, and some of what their defensive scheme was, and Larry Bird would say this, that they credited a lot of what they did on the defensive end over like 15 years with Dan Burke being there. And what they did principally continued after Frank left, and with Nate McMillan, the scheme was pretty much the same. They're going to keep a small radius with the bigs. They're going to play conservatively. They do not switch. They kind of saw switching as a cop-out, that they wanted people to play over and really take pride in defending their matchups. They forced turnovers, but not as a product of this, or not as the purpose of the scheme. It was a product of the scheme and with the personnel that they had there. So I do think that Frank instills a defensive identity, and I don't think that none of that should be credited to him, but they did have other people in place that people within the organization would give at least joint credit to. And I didn't always see some flexibility that I would have wanted to see with him with the Lakers, but that's just my outside view.
Yeah, and some of this with any coach obviously comes down to the particulars of the staff. It feels fairly obvious to say that, but it's also true. How you fill out those bench roles is vitally important. I'm curious your outside perspective on how his defensive principles mesh with the Rockets roster as it is now. And, the caveat, obviously they were bad last year because the Rockets are extremely young. But then you look at guys like Alperen Sengun and Jabari Smith Jr. that they, of course, would like to be big parts of their future. We'll see who they bring in this offseason with regards to the cap space. They're going to have another high pick in the 2023 draft, etc. But when you speak to those principles, Alperen Sengun is definitely not anything close to Roy Hibbert in terms of the principle of verticality and a rim protector. Yet he's also someone that at times struggles with switching, which is something that Frank can have an aversion to. Jabari is someone that at the 5 should be pretty flexible. He was a bit stiffer than expected last year, but I think some of it, Paolo's talked about this, Jabari defensively can be very aggressive on his closeouts. And so I think sometimes it's tough to say exactly what is stiffness in terms of not moving his hips well and what is just he gets himself in bad positions defensively because he has to think he thinks he has to get out further than he actually does, and that he should trust his length more. So the way I sort of look at it in terms of like anchoring a Frank Vogel defense, like what the Pacers had with those early 2010s team that had so much length between Paul George, David West, and Luis Scola, and then, of course, Roy Hibbert as the rim protector. I guess you've got 3 potential options as it currently stands in Houston. Sengun as the guy who's been your starting center for at least a season. Jabari Smith Jr., who showed flashes as sort of I'm not going to say an undersized 5, let's say a lightweight 5, because he definitely has the height to be. It's just how you want to play. And then there's sort of mystery box number 3, which is that be it the draft, maybe you get insanely lucky and you get Wemby, or free agency, you go in and bring someone in that has more of that traditional rim protection. Do you have a sense for which of those 3 paths makes the most sense for the way Frank typically coaches?
Yeah, so I'm definitely not speaking this into existence, but like, for instance, if Miles Turner had actually been on the market and the Rockets made a trade there, like that would be ideal for Frank Vogel.
Interesting.
And Miles Turner very much still speaks fondly of Frank Vogel as well and what he did for him during his rookie year. So having somebody like that who can be a traditional rim protector and also be somewhat adjustable, because you can move Miles around to a degree. I don't think you want to do it for an entire game, but if you need to play him at the level or above the level, he is capable of doing that. The Sengun thing, in part for me, is that, it's been 2 years and I don't really know what his ideal pick and roll coverage is, to be honest with you. I agree. I mean, he's undersized. He's 6'9". He gives up strength. He can't withstand a bump very well. So if you have him in drop, it's like, what are you more willing to live with if you're the Houston Rockets, or more willing to bet on, I guess? Are you more willing to bet on Sengun figuring out angles and the machinations of drop coverage, or are you more willing to bet on the other people around him becoming more principled in help coverages and maybe the Rockets being able to find some more length so that you can play him higher up the floor? If it were me personally and I'm scheming it, I think I would like playing Sengun higher or at or above the level, just from like my own experience of having seen what they did with Sabonis a year ago before they ended up trading him. That, Rick Carlisle, after Nate Bjorkgren, tried to use Miles and Sabonis nearly identically, which was never going to work because Sabonis cannot have the league's highest rim frequency funneled to him. He does not have the wingspan to withstand that. He's not the rim protector that Miles Turner is. They went into it and were like, okay, we can't treat these two people the same. We're going to start having Sabonis play at above the level and have him pounce out above, which to his credit, I don't know if he did agility training. I don't know what he did to loosen his hips, but he did improve at that. So the problem with the Pacers is the other defenders around them, they just don't have a lot of strong defenders on the roster. So, if you have Frank Vogel there and he's willing to adapt that scheme to perhaps play Şengün more aggressively, I think that Tari Eason's going to be a guy that Frank Vogel absolutely loves because he's somebody that when I watch him, he plays with such a high motor.
Right.
Is willing to really play into passing lanes and has pretty good instincts there, though he can be prone to gambling at times. But I think Frank could rein some of that in. So, it would just depend, too, that, if you're going to have Şengün as your starting five and that you're going to be defensively vulnerable no matter probably what you scheme for, your offense is just going to have to absolutely kill it. It's like when you watch the Sacramento Kings this year.
Right.
Yeah, they're a bottom five defense, but they also have an historically great offense because they've fully leaned into Sabonis as a fulcrum and running, tons of dribble handoffs and incorporating a lot of, the triangle Golden State concepts under Mike Brown. So I do not probably think that that's what Frank Vogel would do offensively, which leads me into answering your question that it would probably be one of the other two paths.
Okay.
I would think if Frank Vogel's your guy.
Interesting. I think you made a good point about playing Şengün higher up at the level. I think someone made this point couple of weeks back within the Rockets fan base that one of the few things Şengün was kind of good at on defense his rookie year was getting deflections. I think that puts him in a position to do that more. And so if there is a little silver lining to whatever Şengün can bring you on defense, that would be one of them. That being said, as you said, you made the transition as easy as it can be for me. You just mentioned the offense, and you said if you're going to have to play with Şengün, you're going to have to make sure to capitalize on the offense to make up for the defensive shortcomings. Frank Vogel is known as a defensive coach. People are really not optimistic, I'll say, about his offense.
Yeah, I want to say at a high level, I think 7 of his 10 years, he's had a top 10 defense, and 7 of his 10 years, he's had a bottom 10 offense. I want to say that's the stat at a super high level.
Damn. So knowing that, do you think that he can be trusted, to have a lot of input into what the offense looks like? Do you think the Rockets have to bring in maybe a lead assistant that's more, offensively oriented? How do you feel about his offense?
Yeah, so with Indiana, his coaching staff ran it out by, I believe, whenever his tenure was done there. Dan Burke, who was the main defensive coordinator, Nate McMillan, who also doesn't exactly have a reputation for being, an offensive innovator, and then Popeye Jones, because Frank Vogel very much values, which continued with the Lakers with Jason Kidd. He values having a former player on staff with him. So that's what role Popeye Jones filled, and he did a lot of player development with Miles Turner while they were there. That here's what I'll say. I don't think that Frank Vogel's a super innovative offensive coach. I don't think anyone would probably describe him that way. But when you look at some of the rosters he had with the Pacers, it's kind of like, what else was he really expected to do with that group? So I would encourage Rockets fans to go look at the 2015-16, which would have been his final season, when they took the Toronto Raptors to 7 games in the first round. And look exactly at who was on that team. So within 2 years of that team getting beat in that series, I believe there were 6 or 7 players who were no longer in the NBA. So Paul George was basically playing at like a godlike level in that series. George Hill was also pretty good. But if you watch a lot of the offense, and I was trying to go back and find some of the clips that I had from back then, it's almost like you're going on an archaeological dig and finding this relic from the past, because that season was pretty tough because when they headed into it, Larry Bird had said on record that they were going to have Paul George play at the 4, which that was coming into the season after Paul George had shattered his leg. And Paul George, I think rightfully so, was very apprehensive about making that change, especially because of what I had just said about 4s in Frank Vogel's defensive scheme. They were expected to step out above the level and hedge. So if you're somebody like Paul George being inserted into that, that's more wear and tear than he would have ever been used to before. And to me, you make your franchise player feel more comfortable, especially coming off a serious injury, not less. So Paul George kind of pushed back on that very early in the offseason. He did it for one preseason game in which he had to defend against Anthony Davis and was basically like, I was getting my butt kicked. That was horrible. So Frank Vogel adjusted and to kind of capitulate to Larry Bird, played CJ Miles at the 4, and they just could not handle things defensively. So midway through the season, he adjusted again, and now they're starting Lavoy Allen and Jan Mahinmi together, which you can probably imagine in your head offensively what that looked like. But they're actually scoring more points per possession with that group than they were with CJ, though they were playing slower, until eventually then they made another change where Miles Turner, as a rookie, because Miles offered more as a shooter, starting at the 4, until they added, I think they added Ty Lawson in the buyout market. And then Frank again had to make another change because he was like, well, Ty Lawson needs to play at a quicker pace. We can't play Lavoy Allen and Jordan Hill together off the bench because they can't keep pace with him in the open floor. Our bench unit isn't making it. So he shifted Miles Turner back to the 5, but then that made their starting unit worse. So by the time the playoffs got there, I think they put Miles Turner back in the starting lineup. But I think that really long answer for me right there should go to show how many different adjustments he made and was trying to balance what his star player and what his front office was wanting him to do and trying to get the most out of those rosters. But when you watch the offense in those games, like a lot of times it's like him having to run pretty complicated sets where, like, you know, maybe it's Monte Ellis coming off an Iverson pick and Paul George is running the opposite baseline. And then it's like Miles Turner at the elbow, like setting a off ball rescreen until Paul's getting like a hammer to flow into the corner. Like, it was tons of using big bodies as shields who had to be in the paint to run Paul George or CJ Miles through mazes of picks. Like, so there was some ingenuity there of stuff that they had to do, but like, it's just not an ideal situation. Like, I don't think it was super creative, but also, again, like, look at the roster and what were you really expecting?
What did you see a few years later in LA? I feel like the comparisons are so difficult because obviously the Magic roster was just terrible, as Paolo was outlining earlier. That never really had a realistic chance. And then with LA, it's sort of the reverse. Everything you do is centered around LeBron James and Anthony Davis. But at the same time, look, there's obviously a lot of different ways you can run offense through those guys. What did you think of the principles they use, especially in that 2020 championship run? Obviously, things are going to be different simply based on the personnel compared to his Indiana years. But did you see any other changes? I guess just a willingness to try other things conceptually that maybe he didn't in Indiana. Just curious if there was any sort of growth from him over the years, aside from just obviously adjusting to the personnel.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that really stood out to me about that Laker team in 2020 was the pace that they played at. Because if you look at the year prior when Luke Walton was there, they wanted to play fast and they did play fast, but they weren't good at it. Like, LeBron was getting gassed. They couldn't run and maintain that pace. So Frank Vogel comes in, and the Pacers during his tenure, I don't think that they ever ranked high. I think they were in the bottom 10 for 4 of the years. And then maybe in that 15-16 season, they might have sniffed like middle of the pack simply because of what I outlined, that they were starting the year with CJ Miles at the 4 and they kind of had to play faster because of what the defense was. But that was never a calling card of Frank's with Indiana. But then he gets to LA, and I thought that he made a good adjustment because instead of using LeBron as a wide receiver and kind of the way that Luke Walton did, he was like, hey, LeBron's a fantastic passer. Let's just run full court offense with LeBron. And now he's the quarterback. And, you know, Anthony Davis, as much criticism as there is, and rightfully so, that, you know, didn't play solo 5 at the time, because he's playing the 4, that allowed him to leak out. He'd be running out. They were very coordinated with the way they ran the floor to get the most out of that as they could. I think they ranked second in fast break points scored that year, which was not a thing during, you know, when the Pacers were most competitive. So I do think that showed an adaptation and a willingness to get the most out of that roster in a way that the prior coach of that team wasn't doing.
You touched on the Jalen Green, Paul George parallel earlier in the pod, and it's interesting because you're right. The circumstances early in their careers are the opposite in the sense that Paul George needed more freedom. He needed more of, I suppose, a green light encouragement. Whereas with Jalen Green, you could argue less. Now, some of that is a product of personnel. I think a lot of what happened with the Rockets this past offseason, the Christian Wood trade, then ditching Eric Gordon at the deadline, losing Kevin Porter Jr. for a couple of months, there was a distinct lack of shot creation for this year's Rockets. Jabari Smith Jr. is certainly not someone who's going to create his own offense especially at just 19 years old. So nationally, we always sort of bristle at this notion that Jalen Green's a chucker because people who don't really watch the Rockets, and truthfully, I can't blame you. This is a bad team, and just look at the box scores. We'll see him shooting 20-ish times per game and sort of roll their eyes. Some of it is simply a product of his surroundings and the system in place. And we mentioned earlier reasons why I think they want a coach that's been there, done that has some credibility. And so some of the high shot totals for Jalen Green weren't necessarily because he wants to play that way. It's just someone had to take those shots on a really bad Rockets team. With that said, where I do find it very interesting, when Jalen was drafted by the Rockets in 2021, I had Bobby Brown on my podcast. Bobby played for the Rockets a couple of seasons in the late 2010s, and he was actually a teammate of Jalen's on the G League Ignite in that 2020 to 21 bubble season that, of course, Jalen Green was on the Ignite before he was drafted number 2 overall by the Rockets. And I was just picking his brain about, how good is this guy? The obvious questions when your team is about to draft him number 2 overall. And I asked him, are there any NBA players that he reminds you of? And he paused for a bit. And one of the names that came to mind for him was Paul George, in terms of the way they both sort of glide on the floor, the sneaky athleticism, their ability to shoot from various angles off the ball. And that's something that I feel like has gotten a bit lost with Jalen. He's been so on ball this year. Going into the NBA, one of his strengths was operating off ball. Unfortunately, with the Rockets, there's not much around him. They also don't have a traditional point guard, so he's taken on more and more on-ball creation reps, which maybe that's better for his on-court development. Time will tell. But I think for him to ultimately realize his value, most Rockets fans want him to get back closer to the off-ball model that we saw a lot of Jalen doing as a rookie. And there were more veterans on that team, as I mentioned, Christian Wood, Eric Gordon, you had Şengün feasting against backups, and so on and so forth. So when I look at Paul George, and I guess in this case, the Vogel-George hypothetical compared, or the Vogel-George reality compared to a hypothetical Vogel-Jalen Green pairing. And I was told, by the way, that Vogel did share an affinity for Jalen Green in the interview process, mentioned that he was very difficult for the Lakers to prepare for. Certainly can't hurt his chances. But I think in terms of getting Jalen to the next level, I think one thing that a lot of Rockets fans want to see is more of a priority on his off-ball game. And that's something that Paul George has always, if not excelled at, from an early stage of his career, was someone that was very feared around the league for the little subtle things he would do away from the ball. What did Frank Vogel do, I guess, in that capacity to help Paul George's development? And we should mention, by the way, Frank Vogel got a nice shout out. We're recording this Sunday night after the Lakers won game 1 of their series against the Grizzlies. LeBron actually mentioned in his post-game conference, talking about Austin Reeves, who had the massive fourth quarter, that Vogel deserves a lot of credit because he simply threw Reeves out there a year ago, let him learn. He saw something there, and now, of course, Reeves has turned into a legitimate starting caliber player on a good team. So I want to get back, of course, to Paul George. Just want to throw that in because it happened today. But Caitlin, what do you think about, I suppose, the things that Vogel did for Paul George, not just on the ball, but off, and how much of that is potentially translatable to what the Rockets need to do with Jalen here in Houston?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I saw that quote from LeBron, and when I saw it, I was like, those are the exact same things that Paul George has used to describe Frank Vogel, the same way that LeBron used to describe with Austin Reeves. But with Paul, yeah, I mean, I think early on, especially with Indiana, like his handle didn't become what his handle is now until he got to Oklahoma City. And that's in part just because he started working, I believe, with Mike Penberthy, who had done dribbling work, I think, with Kobe and other Lakers, and that really moved his handle along in terms of like his ability to snake through the lane and other stuff that just really wasn't there completely with the Pacers. I do remember Frank Vogel having a strict rule with him about splitting screens, that he could do it, and then once if he got a turnover, like his ability to do it again was revoked if he couldn't maintain his handle. So like a lot
That's
of what
hilarious.
a lot of what Frank did with him was off-ball stuff. Like me talking about those sets, in part they needed to do that because that was their only form of shooting and spacing with a lot of what the rosters were. But like if you look at the 15-16 info on Synergy, like I think they were like ranked second in and possessions off screens to maybe only Golden State that year, because they just had to be using him and CJ so much in that situation. But also, like, he was just better utilized at that point in time in his career as a play finisher. And then it became great for him when he got with, OKC, and then even more so with the Clippers and more of the point role that he's able to do now with the development of his handle, where he does more on ball than what you would have ever seen with Indiana. So I do think that there's a way where, you learn how to crawl before you walk. And maybe if you do dial back some of what Jalen's doing or has been forced to kind of have to do on ball because of what personnel situations have been, and you use him in some of those off ball sets, which some of them I think are still relevant. Others, like when you look back at it, like me saying that about an archaeological dig, like you're going to see CJ Miles curling for a lot of twos. It's kind of like why a lot of NBA teams now don't run floppy as much, like other than Nate McMillan with the Atlanta Hawks. Like most teams don't run floppy as a play that much because it has a tendency to lead to, curling into tough shots that become 2-pointers if teams run you off the line. So there are some stuff like that I think that you might have to work out that, was okay back then in the early 2010s that teams aren't doing as much now. But yeah, I mean, I think that your point on Jalen and being able to dial some of that back might ultimately help him grow out more of his game too.
So we talked about Jalen, who is the most important guy on this team right now. And we've talked about Sengun a little bit when it comes to the defense. How do you think some of these other guys that we currently have on the team that we don't know if they'll be on the team next year, but still, Tari Eason, Jabari Smith, perhaps KPJ, maybe KJ Martin, how do you think they fit into what Frank Vogel wants to do?
Yeah, and let me throw in a quick follow-up to that. I think one thing that a lot of Rockets fans want to know is how dependent Frank's system is on a quote-unquote traditional point guard. Because, Caitlin, I don't know how much you interact with Rockets Twitter, but the biggest debate, and it's so tiring now, I just roll my eyes every time I see it, is Kevin Porter Jr. a point guard? And there's some people that are fixated on the idea that you need a traditional floor general, which clearly he's not. There's others that are open to the idea that traditional floor generals are, of course, an increasingly less prevalent breed in the 2020s NBA. So I'm curious your thoughts on him in particular. Does the Frank Vogel system need, I guess, someone with a bit more vision to run it, or is it less point guard centric?
Okay, so to the point guard question, that's actually pretty funny because one of the biggest debated topics back during that time when the Pacers were at contender level was whether George Hill was a real point guard.
Yeah,
like,
I remember that.
That was debated all the time. And I would say that, I mean, he wasn't. He was used as a combo guard. I mean, and the same was true with Darren Collison before George Hill ultimately usurped him. And part of the reason why George Hill usurped him is because his defense was better and because they could put him in the corner and he could make shots and he was just playing at a better level than Darren Collison. So I think overall the answer to that would be no. Like between he and Lance Stevenson and Paul George, it was much more by committee than having somebody who was a traditional quote unquote floor general. Like there were fans all the time bringing up, people like Ricky Rubio, like Rajon Rondo, and whether that was necessary. And, the Pacers, I don't think that's the reason they got eliminated by the Miami Heat. I'll just put it that way. Like, were there times when the Miami Heat was playing a blitzing coverage where George Hill could have been better at passing out of it? And were they overall better when he played with a more aggressive mentality? Yes. But was Frank Vogel's system dependent on having a player like that in the role? I don't think so. So I think that you could continue on with Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green if you wanted to. Like, I mean, I know that there's been rumors out there potentially of their interest in Fred VanVleet and who was the other point guard that they've been interested in. I think I'm drawing a blank there.
Well, James Harden has been mentioned a few times.
Yeah, just a few. Yep, that's probably what I was thinking of. As far as Jabari, I guess I didn't get to see a ton of the Rockets down the stretch, with the exception of he had a pretty standout game against the Indiana Pacers, obviously.
Right, that's what I was going to say. Somehow his best game was against the Pacers, that one where he hit the three with like a second left to send it to overtime.
So how are you guys feeling about his ability? Like, I watched him quite a bit going into the draft last year because we were doing draft coverage. How are you feeling about the development of his ability to get downhill at all? Can he put the ball on the floor?
Oh, it's way better than what was advertised pre-draft. If anything, I would say he progressed. That was the brightest, highlight of his season, and the lowest low light was probably his shooting not living up to expectation.
Yeah, he had a really interesting rookie year, and that the strength was supposed to be the shooting, and that just never translated. I think some of it comes down to the longer 3-point line sort of throwing his mechanics out of whack. I'm sure, there's some confidence that goes with being a 19-year-old rookie and so on and so forth. But I think, like, in the big picture, some of the things he showed going downhill were actually a bit better. And of course, the reason I say better, we all had very low expectations. A lot of people, Rockets fans went into the draft expecting to get Paolo Banchero. We all knew what Jabari's weakness was by comparison. And so it's tough, though, to say how much of his strengths were actually going downhill. He's certainly not very shifty or creative with his handle. The thing they just got better at, I would say, month by month, and especially after the All-Star break, he just gradually realized, hey, I'm 6'11" and I've got a high release point. And when you have that profile, even if you're not the shiftiest guy, even if you're not the most savvy on your drives with your footwork, you can just elevate straight over guys. And that's what he did a bit more as he closed out the season with a bit better numbers over the last couple of months. You saw him going downhill, and a lot of it would just be, taking, I would say, running 14 footers where he would just rise and fire over someone. And so it's sort of a convoluted answer because it's not, traditionally what you consider going downhill, but it just works for him because of his body type. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I think with the Pacers, like when you're looking at the bigs that Frank Vogel had to work with, he never had anybody like Jabari or
Right.
Sengun. Like, we're talking about David West, who was, like an incredibly efficient at slipping picks and picking and popping to mid-range. And then by the end of Roy Hibbert's tenure, especially during what people kind of call the replacements year, when they were playing very deep into the bench, when Paul George was out for the entire year, they kind of shifted. Roy Hibbert's shot distance got longer, in part because teams were dropping against him. What his game around the basket was, they started having him shoot more jump shots. But like David West was never pushed to pop out to three. He was never pushed to be a stretch four. Roy Hibbert was never close to being a stretch five. So you never really got to fully see that development. So you would kind of have to look more so, I think, to what Frank Vogel did with Anthony Davis and the Lakers. I mean, obviously, Anthony Davis posted a lot, but we all know what he did as a shooter, and especially out the three-point range when they were in the bubble, and how that important that was to their ability to secure the title that year. So I think he probably has adjusted his mentality there a bit. I mean, I remember thinking a lot that it would have been better for the Pacers if David West, even if he wasn't shooting them at a very high clip, would have been willing to, if they could get him to take a couple threes a game just for the positioning standpoint of it, to open up the floor. But the game was also very different then. So
I want to ask you about some of the non-X's and O's aspects of a potential Frank Vogel hire. And I'm looking, so the Sporting News recently had a very interesting article on a prospective NBA coach named Caitlin Cooper. I'm kidding, of course, because you were asked in this about, potentially being a coach one day, given your X's and O's acumen, and your response was no. And I'm going to read you the quote. I've seen behind the curtain. I know how much that takes. I think people think coaching is all about X's and O's, when in reality, that's a very small part of it. You have to be a motivator and a counselor, wear a lot of different hats. I'm more the person who's sitting and staring at my laptop, looking for where any tiny advantages might be. So in terms of the non-X's and O's of Frank Vogel, I feel like he's someone that nationally, even though he's coached 10 years, a lot of people don't have a good sense for his personality, because Indiana is obviously a very small market. And with the Lakers, a coach always feels like they're somewhat in the background behind, well, the LeBron and Anthony Davis era Lakers. Let's clarify that. So for people who don't know the other sides of Frank Vogel, the day-to-day, what he's like in the locker room, on the practice court, dealing with media, you mentioned earlier him being sort of a positive presence for the Pacers early on in the 2010s, which was a point in which they never bottomed out to the extent the Rockets had, but they'd had several in the post Reggie Miller, Ron Artest years, had several 30s-ish win seasons and needing that breath of fresh air and positivity. What's he like as far as those other aspects of the game? What's something about Frank Vogel, the person, that maybe, people who didn't watch him enough when he was on a small market Indiana or Orlando team, or just overshadowed by LeBron James and Anthony Davis, what's something that people, Rockets fans in this case, might not know about him?
Right. So I think this is a very good question. There's a lot to unpack there. So I know Paul George has commented, and I referenced it before, but like even if they were going through bad stretches, he said how valuable it was that Frank Vogel would always find a positive and something good that they were doing during the stretch that they could hang their hats on. And I think that that's what they needed at the time. But I also remember David West having a quote the first season that he came over where, everybody knew that that's kind of what Frank's personality was, including with the media, where I know that the media always very much appreciated Frank Vogel and the way he handled things with them. But David said that at halftime that one of the most standout moments for him was that Frank just really tore into them. And David's like, that's when I knew he was the right guy for the job, because he was also willing to be tough, and he could be tough when we needed him to be. Because, there was a lot on David and that team to be kind of the adult in the room because they were so young when they started to really come into their own. But then when you look at the 13-14 season, you can have some questions as to, how did Frank Vogel exactly manage adversity? Because so much was going wrong toward the back half of that season. I don't know if everybody will remember, but they kind of had a hard time managing success. There's always the joke that the GQ photo that all five of them took together was kind of the curse that turned things sour. But in all honesty, I think that they really did have some kind of maturity issues. There was a lot of rumors and gossip surrounding Paul George. You had Roy Hibbert in the media talking about selfish dudes. Larry Bird's decision to move Danny Granger for Evan Turner, I don't think was ever very popular. Bringing in Andrew Bynum kind of tanked Roy Hibbert's confidence. The league had started to find some ways to attack their defensive scheme, whether it was playing with more pace, whether it was attacking David West instead of running screens at Roy Hibbert, or it was attacking the side of the floor, or, running a double drag where David West was the second screener or somebody else was the second screener so they could avoid Roy. Like little by little, there was all these cracks in the foundation. And while they never bottomed out, they still had a quote unquote winning record over the back end of that season. It became a struggle bus. I mean, over the back end of that season, they didn't have a losing record, but it just felt like they were limping into the Eastern Conference Finals, and it never felt like all of that internally was ever fully managed. And I also think this is really hard why, as fans or people from the outside in general, like I've been around several Pacers coaches searches over the last 4 or 5 years, and this is why it's so hard to project a coach in a new setting, because without being in on these interviews and fully knowing who the coaches are as people, you can never, I don't think, fully know. Like you can look at what, Nate Bjorkgren maybe did with his G League teams, or look at how Nick Nurse runs a team with Toronto, but you don't know how Nate Bjorkgren's going to be at managing people. And that was ultimately the reason why the Pacers ended up moving on from Nate Bjorkgren and going to Rick Carlisle. So I think that that's pretty tough, but I think all in all, Frank Vogel as a human being has a pretty good reputation amongst the people that he's worked with. I will say one quote that stood out after the fact, that was when Roy Hibbert started playing for the Lakers. He had said on record, like nothing against Frank Vogel, but that he wanted to play with somebody who had been a former player. And I kind of wonder if that goes into why Frank Vogel takes it very seriously, that he always will have a former player on his coaching staff. So that's one thing. But other than that, like the players who have played for him and then have moved to other markets, Paul George still speaks very highly of him. When Frank Vogel was let go, Danny Granger, I believe, tweeted something about, still having a lot of respect for Frank. George Hill still speaks fondly of Frank. So I think overall, the players who have played for him have respect for him.
Yeah, and I know Paolo's going to follow up to that. I just want to interject very quickly on the importance of interviews. That's actually a big part of why Frank, as I understand it, is one of the front runners right now alongside Ime Udoka. A lot of people have linked Nick Nurse to the Rockets the last few weeks, but the problem is this dance with the interview. The Rockets can complete thorough interviews with Vogel and Udoka. With Nick Nurse, they have some relationship with him going back to his days with the Rio Grande Valley Vipers, Houston's G League affiliate, although I've been told that's slightly overstated just from the standpoint of Houston's had so much front office turnover. For Nurse and the Vipers, you got to go back 10 years at this point. So other than Rafael Stone and Eli Whitus, who were not in their current roles or anything close to them at that time, a lot of the other guys have since moved on. And so the interview process is very, very important to finding that alignment. And yet Nurse is under contract with Toronto. The Raptors are not going to let him interview with another team while he's under contract. He would have to negotiate basically a divorce, whatever settlement, the terms that would allow him to move on to his next gig. The Raptors would have to be amenable to allowing him to do that, of course. And yet, from Houston's standpoint, it's not as if they can guarantee him the job. Frank Vogel is very qualified. Ime Udoka is very qualified. Kenny Atkinson is very qualified. So it doesn't make sense for the Rockets to guarantee Nurse the job without interviewing. Yet I'm not sure it makes sense for Nurse to give back this guaranteed money without knowing he's going to get the Rockets job. So I think there's sort of a standoff right now, and that's where guys like Frank and Udoka, who can totally go through the process, probably have a leg up. Sorry for interjecting, Paolo. Just wanted to explain the dynamic. If Nurse wants the job badly enough that he's willing to sort of take the leap of faith that he'll go through a normal interview process, then I think he can absolutely get into the equation. But right now, I think that's where the Rockets are, and that's why Vogel and Udoka have a clearer path, because they can actually go through this process that Caitlin was explaining.
Yeah, for sure. In the meantime, I'm just thinking how Caitlin mentioned limping into the Eastern Conference Finals, and how I wish the Rockets could limp into the Western Conference Finals. No, but my question to tie into what Ben said, my question will be, the names Ben mentioned between Vogel, Udoka, Nurse, and Atkinson. How do you think Vogel stacks up against these other three guys that are, the three main guys according to just the rumors that are circling that the Rockets have as their options?
Right. So let's start with Nick Nurse, and I'll say this, that I have some experience watching how the Raptors system on both ends of the floor gets transplanted from Toronto to another team, because when Nate Bjorkgren was under his 1 year, very turbulent tenure with the Pacers, the playbook was almost identical offensively from the Toronto Raptors and defensively. Now, there have been some changes. They weren't playing, the full Project 6-9 the prior year from when Nate Bjorkgren came over, because they were still had, Ibaka and Marc Gasol at the time and Pascal Siakam. But that system was almost identical. And when they tried to do it with the Indiana Pacers, it did not work. Trying to do the disorienting defense and shifting from box and one and triangle and two, the defense was hyper aggressive in a way that was never going to work with Sabonis. And the zone defenses were so underbaked that I know somewhat on authority that they were not, especially given what that season was after COVID and how little practice time they had, they weren't practicing those things. They basically were getting told, go out there and play triangle and two, and it did not go well. Nothing of that sit well on the roster. And I think sometimes from the outside looking in with Nick Nurse, I think people have the impression that they have all this defensive versatility. And I don't think that they're versatile in scheme. I think that they're versatile in having wing players, and that gives people the impression that Nick is running this really versatile, inventive type stuff. And I think sometimes it can border a little bit on gimmicky, in my opinion. And I just saw how that kind of flatlined with the Pacers. So I might have somewhat of an internal bias there with regards to him. As to the other two, I think Udoka would have a little bit more versatility defensively than what Frank Vogel showed with the Pacers. I think that the adjustments that he made last year, particularly with using Robert Williams as the roaming big, were very key to changing things up for the Celtics, in addition to the trades that they made, bringing in Derek White. I'm not necessarily the best person to speak with regards to Udoka, because there's obviously power dynamics in play as to why he's not currently employed. And there's also, very serious racial undertones with regards to some of that too. So I won't speak completely on that, but that certainly makes things a little bit more complicated for the Rockets if they're going to be the first team to employ him in the wake of that. As far as Kenny Atkinson, the one thing that I really like about the idea of, two things about the idea of Kenny Atkinson with the Rockets is that he has been coaching with Steve Kerr. So if we look at Mike Brown going from Golden State to Sacramento, we can see how that changed and how Mike evolved as a coach, and how incorporating some of those triangle concepts, some of the dribble handoffs, a lot of the stuff that Steve Kerr does with Draymond Green, he now does with Domantas Sabonis, and fully leaned into offensively. I think that there's a world where maybe Kenny Atkinson could also take some of that. And it works very well with Sengun if you're going to lean more into offense. And I also think that what Kenny Atkinson already showed in Brooklyn, when he had the group with Spencer Dinwiddie and Karis LeVert and D'Angelo Russell, in terms of his motion offense, could work pretty well with the other guys too, in terms of yes, there's a free flowing aspect of Kenny Atkinson's motions offense, but there also is enough play calling where I think it's good for Jalen Green not to have, so much, of the freewheeling freedom to be relying on him to be making reads, even though I think
Mhm.
overall that's where you want him to get to. But I think it would be better to maybe have some structure in the early going. So I think it's kind of a question of, what overall identity do Rafael and Eli see that they want the team to take on, and maybe can you find a defensive coordinator with Kenny Atkinson that you feel strong enough for? Because I think offensively that could be a really strong fit for Houston, but I also don't want it to sound like I'm completely downplaying Frank Vogel, because I do think that somewhat the way his tenure ended with the Pacers and the way things ended with the Lakers, as Paolo mentioned, with, obviously the complications of Russell Westbrook playing two bigs at once, with how they kind of dismantled the very identity that helped them be a contender, and the roster was not that anymore.
Yeah.
Cheaping out and not wanting to pay Caruso really kind of dampened
Yep.
what people's opinions of Frank Vogel are.
The way I would sum it up, that I believe the Rockets are looking at it, and I think it meshes with a lot of your insight there. I think the appeal to Frank is that he's handled so many different types of situations
Yeah.
over his 10 years as a head coach, and obviously much more than that as an assistant. It's crazy that he's just 49 years old, because he has so much experience. You'd think superficially he might be, pushing 60 given how many spots he's been in, but he's been there, done that on so many fronts, and found at least some success. I suppose the one exception is the 2 Orlando years, but I don't think, as Paolo was laying out, I don't think anybody could really succeed in that situation in a 2-year sample at that. With Udoka and Atkinson, there's potentially more upside, but there's also a bit more risk in that, the situations they inherited were much more tailored in scope. Obviously, Udoka walked into a fantastic situation in terms of the depth of the roster in Boston. Now, he did need to manage egos, that goes without saying, but it's just speaking of the team he inherited. And then with Atkinson, he got the Nets off of the ground floor, but in terms of doing his system at a contending level, certainly he's contributing to a contender now with the Warriors, but that's as the lead assistant. I think, the Mike Brown parallel you brought up is ideal for, I think, if you wanted to gamble on Kenny, but it would be something of a gamble. And so Frank has more certainty. With Udoka and Atkinson, there's theoretically more upside. I think there's more buzz to those names, but there's also a bit more risk in that you haven't seen them inherit a situation as unique as the one that the Houston coach is going to get, basically a hodgepodge of, incredible young players from this past year and a 2023 lottery pick, combined with the veterans they bring in with $60 million in cap space and an incentive to win quickly, given that they're not going to have their draft pick in all likelihood. So I think the appeal to Frank is that he has a high floor in a coaching sense. There's nothing that's going to overwhelm him. I guess the appeal to Udoka and Atkinson is that there might be a bit higher of a ceiling in regards to some of their concepts. And then from there, it just depends on, I suppose, Udoka more defensive minded, Atkinson more offensive minded, and then beyond that, it's just the other extracurricular factors, obviously how they interview. And then with Udoka, there's a separate ball of wax that has to be considered there that I don't want to go into, because boy, that we could do an entire podcast on that. But I think that's the way I would frame it. I guess Udoka and Atkinson might be higher risk, but also higher ceilings. And with Frank, the appeal is that nothing's going to overwhelm him. He's going to be able to handle everything. Is that sort of a fair way that you look at those three?
Yeah, because I think, like what I said, I mean, the one thing that I think that I would want to relay to Rockets fans that they might not know is when Frank's tenure came to an end in that 2016 season, and, Larry Bird kind of said, the whole 3 years, a voice grows stale. That was kind of bizarre at the time. And while I do not have this, I'm not reporting this, I do not have this on authority. One layer of context I would add to those comments is Larry Bird himself was preparing to step down from that job at the end of the following season. Kevin Pritchard was going to ascend into that role. And at the time, Larry Bird was like, I've always really kind of admired Nate McMillan. Well, Kevin Pritchard and Nate McMillan worked very closely, obviously, already in Portland before they were there. So I always kind of questioned it at the time, because they did not fire Frank Vogel. His contract was up and they chose not to renew it. So I kind of always wondered at the time, were they already setting up Kevin Pritchard with the guy he was going to want?
Interesting.
So clearing the path so that Nate McMillan would be there. They had already worked together. more so. And then that was just kind of the reason that they came up with. I do think that
Interesting.
there was points to look at in that 15-16 series. Like, that roster was ridiculous. Paul George, like I said, was playing at like a godlike level. George Hill played at a very high level. It was impressive that they got that to 7 games, all things considered. But you could point to, like, they had the opportunity to go up 3-2, go back to Indianapolis with an edge and potentially close that thing out. In game 5, they had like a 15-point lead at the end of that third quarter. And something that Frank Vogel had kept sticking to throughout that season and in the series was he did not want to stagger the rotation and take minutes where, it was either just George Hill or just Paul George or just Monte Ellis. So he tried to swing with an all bench unit. And one of Toronto's strengths during the Kyle Lowry, DeMar DeRozan, Dwayne Casey years was how lethal their bench unit was. So basically the whole lead gets chipped away until they're about halfway through the fourth quarter. And then he puts Paul George back in and he says, well, I thought Paul George looked tired, so we thought we had a good enough lead that we could maintain. But like, they got absolutely worked over in all those all bench unit minutes, and they kept sticking to him. So it's like, you're talking like Ty Lawson, CJ Miles, Rodney Stuckey. Like, these are not world beating lineups. And he was very kind of stubborn with not wanting to stagger those 3 guys out. So I do think that it wasn't completely a raw deal to move on from Frank, but certainly the way it was framed was less than ideal, especially since Larry Bird also, for some reason, felt the need to expose the fact that Frank had kind of begged for his job on the phone. That was not well received with Indiana media that got revealed. So between that and how things went with the Lakers, I think that he gets colored a lot worse than what he is as a coach. And I think I like the way that you put it. I think that also applies to what Nate McMillan's tenure with the Pacers was. I think that you can count on there being a consistent product on the floor and a high floor and a try-hard floor, especially with a Nate McMillan, Frank Vogel team being out there. And I also, there's one other thing that I want to toss in there. I fully expect what you said to be true, that the Rockets will bring in veteran players. And I think that Frank Vogel can do a pretty decent job of blending that mix while still getting development out of younger guys, just like what he did with Paul George early on. Like, there were veteran players on that team, but it was like, hey, Paul George is going to start in the playoffs. But being able to balance both sides.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's his strength. He, more than any of the other 4, I think, has an ability that really resonates with the decision makers with the Rockets. Just a calming voice of his ability to handle a lot of different things thrown at him. And there's definitely, given the upheaval the last couple of years and some of the reports, even if they're more perception based than reality, they do take a toll. I think that certainty does have value to the Rockets. Can't say for sure it's going to win the day, but it definitely helps the case for Frank, and why, according to all reports and everything I've heard, he had a great first interview, and it looks like, according to Woj, that he's going to be back for a second as well. We'll see where things go from there. To your point on the contract, I think that's something that will definitely resonate with Rockets fans, because I think that tied into why they let Stephen Silas play out this year. There was a lot of talk during the season, especially when things got off the rails midway through, about them potentially going to an interim. This was the final year of his contract. It was pretty easy for both sides to just basically decline the option rather than turn it into a you're fired type thing. It also prevents any dirty laundry from being leaked. Just a much cleaner break, also easier financially, and that the Rockets are definitely swimming in a higher income bracket with these types of proven coaches that they're going after. So by virtue of simply letting Stevens' contract expire, then that helps them on that front as well. But yeah, I think talking about those dynamics of the Pacers in 2016, there's some commonalities to the way things played out with the Rockets and Stephen Silas in 2023. Anyway, with that, we'll bring this episode to a close. For Paolo Alves and Caitlin Cooper, I'm Ben Dubose. Thanks to everyone who made it through. The best way to get in touch with us if you want more is on Twitter. I'm on there at Ben Dubose. Paolo is on there at Paolo Alves NBA. Caitlin is on there at C2_Cooper. And you can find her Patreon from there, Basketball She Wrote, if you want more insight on the Indiana Pacers. Beyond that, I just encourage you to follow Caitlin, because she's one of the brightest X's and O's minds in all of basketball media. In my opinion, you will learn something if you follow her. So Caitlin, thank you so much for the time. We're so thrilled to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Absolutely. And with that, we will bring this to a close. Again, for Paolo and Caitlin, I'm Ben. Should also throw a shout out to the Logger Line Twitter. That's where you can find, of course, our episodes, but also our link tree, which has links to obviously the individual distributors, but also Rockets Wire, Sports Talk 790, Carbach Brewing, all of our partners. You can find links to their content through our link tree at the Logger Line on Twitter. With the plugs complete, we'll wrap up. For Caitlin and Paolo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Lager Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager by Karbach Brewing.